Tiana Green was just 16 when she solved the unsolvable. But instead of applause, they called security. A black janitor's daughter walks into an Ivy League hall and rewrites an equation the professor called above comprehension. By morning, the internet exploded. By nightfall, the university erased her name. Now she's not just fighting for credit, she's fighting to exist. And the man who tried to bury her brilliance? He's about to face the truth, broadcast live. But can the world handle who really solved it? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. At Halcyon University, prestige dripped from the stone walls like ancient ivy. Here, legacy meant everything. Names were whispered with reverence, degrees framed with gold. The institution prided itself not only on its academic rigor, but on the exclusivity it wrapped itself in like armor. It wasn't just a place of higher learning, it was a fortress of entitlement. Dr. Gerald Whitmore, a fixture of the mathematics department for nearly 2 decades, embodied that entitlement with effortless cruelty. He wasn't just brilliant, he knew it, and made sure everyone else did too. His lectures were more performance than instruction, designed less for education and more for ego. Students tolerated his arrogance because they had no choice. He held the power to define their futures. That morning he entered the grand lecture hall with the air of a man who had just written history. Without a greeting, without even glancing at the rows of students settling into their chairs, he turned to the towering whiteboard and uncapped a marker. The equation he wrote stretched nearly the full length of the board. Complex symbols, recursive patterns, and unspoken riddles emerged in sharp, looping handwriting. Gasps came softly from a few students. Others squinted, recognizing fragments but never the whole. It looked less like a lesson and more like a wall erected to keep them out. Dr. Whitmore stepped back, admiring his work. Without turning to the class, he remarked that the equation was not part of the syllabus, nor was it intended for them. It was, as he put it, an abstract framework, far beyond student comprehension, certainly above undergraduate level. The insult was disguised as academic humility, but it landed sharply, especially in this room, where most of the students were first-generation scholars, Black, Latino, and underrepresented minorities. No one responded. No one challenged him. They never did. At the back of the hall, unnoticed among the noise of intellectual dismissal, was Luther Green, janitor, night shift. 47 years old. His presence blended into the background like the worn mop he leaned on. He was cleaning up discarded coffee cups and resetting chairs with methodical quiet. His posture bent not from age, but from years of being looked through, rather than at. What no one realized was that Luther had once walked lecture halls like these, not as a cleaner but as a student, before racist hiring practices and economic barriers dismantled his academic path. He had dreamt of being an engineer. Now, instead of designing systems, he maintained the buildings that housed those who did. Just beyond the lecture doors, his daughter Tiana stood in shadow, her back pressed against the cold wall, her breath caught between fascination and fury. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had skipped her own classes that morning, drawn to Halcyon's campus like a moth to flame. The towering walls intimidated her, but the curiosity in her bones pushed her past the fear. She had come only to wait for her father, to walk home together. But when she heard the lecture begin, her instincts led her to the door, and then she saw the board. The moment her eyes traced the equation, something flickered behind them. A memory, a puzzle, a familiarity that didn't make sense, yet couldn't be denied. At 16, Tiana should have been in AP Calculus at her local public high school, but they hadn't offered it. Budget constraints, they said. Focus on grade-level work, they said. But Tiana had been outpacing her curriculum since she was 11, teaching herself from old college textbooks salvaged from the library's discard bin. What no one knew was that her real classroom was her father's janitor closet, where the smell of bleach mixed with the sound of mechanical pencil scratches on scrap paper. Luther never stopped being an engineer. He simply passed the torch in secret, in between cleaning duties and overnight shifts. He had taught Tiana everything he knew, and Tiana absorbed it all with the hunger of someone who'd been locked out of a feast her entire life. Now, as she studied the sprawling symbols on the board, she didn't just understand them. She recognized the mistake Whitmore had made, a subtle assumption buried beneath the second transformation. It was the kind of mistake someone made when they underestimated their audience so deeply, they stopped checking their own work. Tiana didn't smirk, not because she wasn't confident, but because she knew the danger of being seen as confident in rooms where people like her weren't expected to be present at all. Instead, she pulled back further into the corridor, heart racing. Her hand reached into her bag and tightened around her father's old engineering notebook. She didn't need to write it down, not yet. But she knew what she would do tonight. Across the lecture hall, Whitmore dismissed the class early, leaving the equation unfinished, unexplained, and unchallenged. He exited with the quiet arrogance of a man who had just confirmed what he believed all along, that brilliance belonged to people like him, and no one else. Tiana waited until the room emptied, then stepped inside. Her father looked up, surprised to see her, and immediately signaled for her to leave before anyone noticed. But she didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the whiteboard, as if trying to burn the symbols into memory. Luther didn't question her. He had seen that look before in himself, decades ago. Later that night, Tiana sat cross-legged on the floor of their small living room, surrounded by crumpled papers and equations rewritten a dozen times. Her mother, long gone, had once said Tiana was born with a fire in her. That fire had survived redlining, underfunded schools, ignored report cards, and teachers who mistook brilliance for disobedience. By midnight, the solution was done. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that she hadn't been alone in the lecture hall. From the upper floor offices above the lecture space, a dim light had glowed late into the afternoon. Elijah Monroe, a doctoral student, had returned to grab his charger. His path had taken him past the glass rail that overlooked the lecture room below. There, he had paused and watched. At first, he had assumed Tiana was a student who had returned for notes. But the way she approached the board, the methodical way she studied each line, then rewrote it in fragments. It was unlike anything he'd seen in years of tutoring undergraduates. She wasn't guessing. She was dissecting. Elijah didn't recognize her face. But he recognized what he was seeing, raw, unfiltered brilliance. He stayed silent. He didn't want to interrupt the flow of something sacred. But before she left, just as she capped the marker and stepped back to take one final look at the corrected board, he took a photo from above. Not of her, but of the work. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. By morning, the entire faculty would know the equation had been solved, and no one would know by whom. That night, Tiana would secretly solve the problem, but someone unexpected would see her do it. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Halcyon's mathematics building, casting long golden rectangles across the marble floor. The campus, once humming with the clamor of students and hurried footsteps, had settled into its quietest hour. It was during this silence, when eyes turned elsewhere and the institution exhaled, that Tiana returned. She walked the halls with deliberate care, the soft thud of her sneakers echoing against the polished surfaces. Every door she passed seemed to hum with the weight of secrets and selective memory. Halcyon's architecture, as grand as it was unforgiving, wasn't built for her, not for someone like her. Every hallway reminded her of that. But she didn't come for their permission. Clutched tightly beneath her arm was her father's old engineering notebook. The cover was cracked from years of use, the spine reinforced with tape. Inside, pages were filled with his handwriting. Equations, diagrams, scribbled thoughts from a life that had once believed in its own potential. It was more than a keepsake. It was proof that brilliance could exist in forgotten places. In the lecture hall, the whiteboard still bore the remnants of Whitmore's equation, slightly faded but intact. No one had dared erase it. Perhaps they believed it sacred. Perhaps they assumed no one else would touch it. Tiana stepped into the center of the room, the empty rows of seats looming above her like stadium bleachers watching silently. She didn't flinch. She opened the notebook, flipped to a blank page, and reviewed her mental roadmap. Every number, every function, had lived in her mind since that morning. She didn't hesitate. She moved with certainty. Her hand rose. The marker pressed against the board with a low squeak. She began. Line by line, she dismantled the towering equation, not with guesses or hesitation, but with structured brilliance. Her mind worked like a machine, forged from intuition and years of silent study. Every decision was a calculated risk, and every risk paid off. As the symbols filled the board, the error Whitmore had buried beneath layers of abstraction was exposed and corrected. Her process wasn't rushed. She moved fluidly, like someone who had practiced this 100 times. But this was the first time she had ever done it in a room built to exclude her. It didn't matter. She claimed the space with every stroke. The chalk dust rose lightly with each correction, like smoke from a fire rekindled. 20 minutes later, she stepped back and looked at what she had done. It wasn't just right, it was elegant. The board, once a monument to exclusion, now bore the truth of her mind, undeniable and untouched by legacy or privilege. But she wasn't alone. Above the lecture hall, just beyond the high glass wall that divided the student offices from the classroom below, Elijah Monroe had returned to campus. He had forgotten his charger, an inconvenience that pulled him back into the building after most had gone home. His footsteps, casual and distracted, paused when he noticed the light still on below. From the vantage point on the mezzanine, he looked down. What he saw didn't make sense. A young girl, someone he didn't recognize, stood in front of the board. She wasn't scribbling like a student racing against time. She was correcting it, refining it. At first, Elijah assumed she might be one of the ambitious students from a different department, sneaking in. But there was something different about her. Her focus was too sharp, her body language too grounded. She wasn't hoping to solve it. She already had. As realization struck, so did something deeper. A sense of injustice, of awe, of recognition. Elijah had spent the last 6 years fighting invisible battles within Halcyon. As a biracial PhD candidate, he knew the walls were thicker for some, even when the doors appeared open. He had seen students of color ignored, ideas dismissed, credits misattributed. He had survived by staying quiet, by not challenging those above him, until now. He watched every movement she made. When she stepped back and surveyed the board, his hand went instinctively to his phone. He snapped a photo of the board, just the board, before she erased it, or anyone else saw it. But she didn't erase it. She simply capped the marker, turned, and exited as silently as she'd arrived. Elijah stood frozen. He didn't know who she was, but he knew what he had just witnessed, a solution. One that Halcyon's most decorated professor had called impossible. That morning, his mind raced. Was this real? Was she a student? A visitor? A trick of the light? It didn't matter. What he saw couldn't be undone. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his dorm room, staring at the photo on his phone. He enlarged it, checking every line, every symbol. He followed the logic. It was sound. Not only that, it was beyond anything he had seen in his department's recent thesis defenses. Still unsure of what to do, he uploaded the image to the private WhatsApp group shared by the math faculty. He didn't say who solved it. He didn't know, but he added a caption: "Someone just cracked Whitmore's wall." Thought? Within minutes, responses lit up the thread. Confusion, disbelief, denial, then silence. One professor speculated that it was a prank. Another suggested it might be AI generated, but the math held. No one could find a flaw. Whitmore didn't respond. Not yet. Elijah debated messaging him directly, but something inside held him back. The politics were already sharp. Naming the solver, especially if it was someone unexpected, someone who didn't belong, could backfire in ways he couldn't yet calculate. So, for now, he left the name out. But he didn't delete the image. Back in their small apartment on the edge of town, Tiana sat cross-legged on the carpet, reviewing her own copy of the equation in her notebook. Her father, exhausted from a double shift, had already gone to bed. The silence felt heavy, not threatening, just weighty, like something unfinished. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't plan on being seen, but she had left her mark in the one place they said she didn't belong. She had solved the unsolvable. She just didn't know yet. The equation wasn't the only thing being watched. Elijah snapped a photo of the board and sent it to a faculty WhatsApp group, but he left Tiana's name out. The storm was brewing inside the pristine walls of Halcyon, before the world could see it coming. Dr. Gerald Whitmore had been silent for 3 days, a record for a man who normally filled the air with his authority. While the internet laughed, praised, and speculated, he worked behind the scenes with the calm of someone sharpening a blade. He was not just angry. He was cornered, and when men like him feel cornered, they don't crumble. They calculate. He began with access logs. Halcyon's campus was lined with discreet security cameras, not for safety as they claimed, but for control. Every hallway, every lecture room, every stairwell. Whitmore pulled the footage from the evening the photo had appeared. It didn't take long to find the clip. There she was. A teenage girl in a gray hoodie and worn-out sneakers, entering the hall like she belonged there, stepping up to the board like she owned the air. He watched the video 3 times, barely blinking. Then he turned to the custodial schedules. Luther Green, night shift, assigned to the math wing that night, and Tiana Green, listed as his emergency contact. The pieces snapped together. Whitmore didn't see a prodigy. He saw a violation, not just of property, but of tradition. In his eyes, Halcyon had always been a fortress of merit, where only the chosen were permitted to challenge the gate. Tiana hadn't been chosen. She hadn't even been admitted, and yet she had dared to rewrite the very equation he had called above comprehension. He summoned Elijah Monroe next. Behind closed doors, Whitmore questioned him with veiled threats. He hinted at academic misconduct, plagiarism, interference. Elijah, careful and composed, denied knowing the girl's identity, technically true though barely. He refused to retract the image. But he knew Whitmore was closing in. Hours later, 2 campus security guards appeared in the hallway, outside the custodial office. Luther and Tiana were finishing up their shift when they saw the uniforms. The hall emptied fast, silence rushing in like a vacuum. The guards didn't ask questions. They presented a typed letter, formal, cold, and bureaucratic. Tiana was accused of unauthorized access to restricted academic material, of trespassing in a faculty-only area, of creating unverified modifications to university property. The language was wrapped in policy, but the message was racial and unmistakable. Luther's face went pale as he read the letter, hands trembling beneath the weight of memory. It was happening again, only this time it was his daughter. His breath caught, trapped between outrage and helplessness. Security escorted Tiana out through the side exit of the building. No cuffs, no raised voices, just slow, public humiliation. Students and faculty stared from doorways and stairwells, eyes full of curiosity, fear, or worse, quiet satisfaction. Not one spoke up. Within hours, her local public school, already fragile in resources and bloated with administrative red tape, suspended her. The reason? Violation of external campus safety protocols. They didn't ask for her side. They didn't need it. A single call from Halcyon had been enough. The world that had praised the anonymous genius a day ago now flipped the script. News sites rushed to revise the narrative. Teen imposter exposed after vandalizing Ivy League math board. Untold minor sparks academic fraud investigation. Photos of her taken from public records began circulating. Headlines focused less on the solution and more on the setting. A janitor's daughter in a lecture hall she wasn't allowed to be in. The same internet that had once worshipped her work now picked her apart. Trolls questioned her upbringing. Critics scrutinized her appearance. Pundits debated whether her solution was really hers. Tiana watched it all unfold in silence. Her phone, once a source of curiosity, now buzzed with hate, threats, and memes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But something inside her, something bright, began to dim. Her father blamed himself. He blamed the broken system. He blamed the name stitched on his uniform, the same name he had once applied to wear as a faculty member, before being rejected without explanation. He wanted to fix it, but had no tools left. In their apartment, the light stayed off for hours. Tiana stared at the wall, knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't even defended herself, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what would follow. Black children who defend themselves are called disruptive, loud, threatening. She had learned long ago that silence was the only thing they couldn't twist. But somewhere in the silence, another voice stirred. Professor Imani Daniels, a tenured but often silenced member of Halcyon's math department, watched the footage of Tiana's removal from the faculty server. She had received no formal notice. She had not been included in Whitmore's private conversations, but she had seen enough. Daniels had always been a thorn in the side of Halcyon's old guard. Too vocal, too radical, too unapologetically black for comfort. Her research had been sidelined, her grants questioned, her course enrollments capped without reason. And yet, she had endured. Now, as she watched a teenage girl be erased for doing something extraordinary, something inside her snapped into action. She reviewed the footage again. She pulled up the image of the solved equation. She compared the two, line by line, stroke by stroke. She wasn't just impressed, she was enraged. Because this wasn't just about one girl. This was about every unrecognized genius, every barrier disguised as protocol, every black scholar told to be grateful for the seat they were allowed to sit in. Tiana hadn't broken in. She had broken through. Daniels didn't call Whitmore. She didn't ask permission. She forwarded the footage to her private research network. She reached out to academic journals. She contacted legal advocacy groups, who specialized in educational discrimination. She wasn't going to wait for Halcyon to correct itself. But one professor, an old rival of Whitmore's, saw the footage and knew the truth. The day after the headlines flipped, the walls of Halcyon whispered, in new frequencies. Some faculty whispered, in fear, others in resentment. But none more quietly than Professor Imani Daniels, and none more dangerously. Daniels had survived Halcyon's internal winters for more than 12 years. A tenured professor, published across academic journals. Twice overlooked for department chair, she had watched as her lectures were reassigned to younger, less qualified white male professors. She had seen her ideas duplicated, her grant proposals delayed, her skin, her voice, and her courage made her a threat. So the institution kept her close enough to boast diversity, but distant enough to keep her out of power. But Daniels had never stopped watching. She had always kept files, quietly collected receipts, memorized patterns. She knew how the machinery worked, because it had tried to grind her down more times than she could count. And now that same machinery had targeted a child. Tiana Green. Daniels hadn't just reviewed the footage once. She'd watched it over and over again, not because she doubted it, but because she needed to understand it completely. She studied the girl's movement, her hesitation, her flow. She saw the way Tiana paused, not from confusion, but precision. She didn't guess her way through the solution. She unpacked it. That night, Daniels requested to meet. She didn't call the dean. She didn't ask permission. She reached out directly through a former colleague who had once mentored Luther, an act of rebellion in itself. They met in the library's basement, a place long forgotten by students obsessed with digital archives and coffee shop aesthetics. Down there, surrounded by silence and dust, the truth felt safer. Tiana entered wearing the same hoodie seen in the footage, but this time her shoulders were heavier. The online slander, the public shame, the punishment for brilliance, it had aged her in days, but her eyes still carried a stubborn flicker. Daniels didn't begin with pleasantries or apologies. She opened to page 12 of the notebook and pointed to a step most professors overlooked. She asked one question, the same one no one had bothered to ask her in court or school or online. How did she know to isolate the derivative at step 12? Tiana explained, not arrogantly, not nervously, but like someone who had lived with the problem long before Whitmore ever placed it on the board. Her explanation wasn't just accurate, it was innovative. She didn't memorize the solution, she constructed it. Her approach diverged from standard academic paths, but reached the same, no, a better result. Daniels closed the notebook and made a decision. She knew what this meant. She also knew what it would cost. Over the next 48 hours, Daniels did something unprecedented. She wrote a paper, a formal academic submission. She detailed the problem, the context, and most importantly, the solution. She annotated it with screenshots from the footage. She outlined the logic behind each correction Tiana had made, citing her as an anonymous prodigy with unrecognized access to Halcyon's mathematical infrastructure. She sent the paper to 5 journals. 3 responded within hours. 2 published it within days. 1 labeled the solution a historic academic breakthrough with disruptive implications. The story now resurfaced with scholarly backing, ignited once more, but this time with fuel poured by someone the system couldn't easily ignore. Daniels didn't stop there. She gave interviews, short, measured, and focused on the brilliance, not the drama. She refused to give Tiana's name, protecting her from further backlash. But she made one thing clear. This solution didn't come from Halcyon's lecture halls. It came from outside, from someone they tried to silence before they knew her name. Within Halcyon, panic spread like smoke. The Board of Regents demanded answers. The math department called an emergency meeting. Whitmore, red-faced and silent, denied ever declaring the problem unsolvable. But video clips from his own lecture contradicted him. Someone leaked a staff email where Whitmore mocked the Reddit circus and their obsession with fantasy prodigies. It was too late. Daniels had flipped the hierarchy. Because if the equation had truly been solved, and not by a professor, not by a doctoral candidate, not even by a registered student, but by the daughter of a janitor with no formal access, then what did it say about the gatekeepers? What did it say about the institution? It said the lie was never about merit. It was about power. The next step was bold and dangerous. Daniels organized a live symposium. a campus-wide event that invited faculty, students, journalists, and educational leaders to witness the equation breakdown in real time. Not by her, not by Whitmore, but by the anonymous solver, the ghost who had shaken academia from outside its walls. The plan was to unveil the solution publicly, not just as a moment of brilliance, but as a confrontation, a mirror held to the faces of those who had called her a trespasser, a vandal, a fraud. Tiana agreed to participate, quietly, cautiously. Her father, hesitant but supportive, accompanied her to campus that afternoon. They arrived through the back entrance, not out of fear but habit. The symposium was held in the same hall, where the equation had first been mocked. Rows of seats filled quickly. Some came to witness history. Others came to protect their reputations. Outside the door, security waited. Daniels approached with Tiana at her side. Credentials were checked. Then, the barrier fell. Tiana's name was not on the list. Security informed her that non-students without faculty sponsorship were not permitted beyond the double doors. Daniels argued. She showed the internal event invite. She showed the published paper. It didn't matter. Halcyon had drawn the line. Tiana stood frozen. Luther placed a hand on her shoulder. The auditorium door was right there, just feet away. On the other side, her future. On this side, their reality. Inside, Whitmore took the podium. He opened with a forced smile and a rebranded introduction. He now called the equation a collaborative effort of collective intellect. He began reviewing it on the board once again, the same board Tiana had stood before. But this time he avoided the mistake she had corrected. He presented a sanitized version. Safe, unchallenging, empty. Daniels watched from the back of the hall, fists clenched. She had seen this before, repackaging truth, burying rebellion beneath policy, sanitizing genius so it could be owned, not honored. She stepped toward the podium. But before she could reach it, the projector above flickered. A new screen appeared behind Whitmore, static. Then movement, then a still frame. It was Tiana's footage. The original video, the girl in the hoodie, solving the problem, alone in the lecture hall. Someone had uploaded it to the university's internal media channel. It played silently, frame by frame. Undeniable. Gasps erupted. Daniels turned, stunned. She hadn't uploaded it, and neither had Tiana. Daniels planned a live symposium to present Tiana's work to the world, but campus security denied her access. The energy outside lecture hall was electric. Rows of students and guests buzzed with speculation, while Halcyon's staff moved briskly, clutching clipboards and whispering into headsets. It was the most packed academic event the math department had hosted in years, but the tension in the air wasn't celebratory. It was uneasy. Something was about to break. Tiana Green stood at the edge of that energy, just outside the double doors. Her backpack, heavy with handwritten notes, and her father's weathered notebook, hung from her shoulder. Beside her, Luther adjusted the collar of the only dress shirt he owned, the one he wore to funerals. He stood tall but uneasy. Daniels stood between them, her presence sharp and commanding, but under her stillness was barely contained rage. Inside the auditorium, the seats had filled to capacity. University administrators occupied the front row, flanked by donors and board members, all eager to see how Halcyon would spin the viral controversy that had left them gasping. Cameras had been mounted discreetly to live stream the symposium. Everyone expected a spectacle. No one expected what was about to unfold. At the doors, a student volunteer looked down at the clipboard, frowning. Tiana's name wasn't there. No ID badge, no enrollment status, no entry. The rules were clear. Daniels stepped forward, citing her own sponsorship. She emphasized that the event was built around the solution the girl in front of them had provided. That without Tiana, there was no reason for this symposium to exist at all. But the student was under orders. He offered apologies she had heard before. Polite, professional, and hollow. It wasn't personal. It was policy. Tiana didn't speak. She had expected this. Her silence wasn't submission. It was survival. Luther, however, did speak. Not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet urgency of a father who had seen his own future stripped from him decades ago, and was now watching history repeat, in real time. Elijah Monroe arrived moments later. His breath quick, his tie loose. He had come straight from his lab, after seeing the live stream countdown. When he learned Tiana had been denied entry, he argued with the event staff, calling in a favor from a faculty ally. But the rules had been sealed by someone higher. Someone who wanted to maintain control. Inside, the symposium began without her. Dr. Whitmore, suited in a tailored navy blazer, stepped to the podium. His voice was measured, his tone carefully rehearsed. He began with a brief history of the equation, its origins, its significance, its intellectual weight. He spoke of theoretical brilliance, of academic rigor, of the difficulty of explaining such advanced work in a public setting. He never mentioned the controversy. Not directly. Instead, he alluded to internet speculation, calling it a distraction. Equations, he said, do not solve themselves. And knowledge without discipline is merely noise. He wrote the problem again on the whiteboard behind him, but altered it. Slight tweaks here and there, enough to make it appear slightly different than the one Tiana had solved. He erased the flaws, removed the trap, smoothed the path. Then he offered a sanitized breakdown that followed traditional steps, complex enough to impress, vague enough to avoid scrutiny. In the back of the auditorium, Daniels remained still, burning. She had known Whitmore would try to reframe the narrative, but she hadn't anticipated how fully the institution would comply. The same faculty who had doubted him days ago now nodded thoughtfully. They didn't want truth. They wanted order. Daniels couldn't let it stand. She stepped toward the media control booth in the corner of the room, flashed her credentials, and with careful words, requested access to the live stream system. The technician hesitated. She explained calmly, it would be a brief clip, visual only, no audio needed. She invoked her tenure, her name, her years of service. The technician relented. Moments later, as Whitmore launched into a segment about lost potential in modern academia, the projector screen behind him flickered. The live stream paused. The audience murmured. Then, a video played. The lecture hall fell into silence. There she was, Tiana Green. The original footage, captured weeks before, appeared frame by frame. No music, no narration, just raw video. A teenage girl in a hoodie, standing alone in an empty lecture hall, facing the whiteboard. Her hands moved quickly, confidently, the same symbols Whitmore had written. The same problem, the same room, but the work on the board was different. Precise, elegant, unedited. She didn't guess. She solved. The crowd gasped audibly as the video continued. Professors leaned forward. Students whispered. One board member stood up. Daniels watched it all, her heart racing but her face unreadable. And then came the moment no one expected. The camera, as if by accident, caught her face, clear, direct. Tiana. There was no more anonymity. Outside the hall, Tiana, Luther and Elijah watched the screen from a tablet streaming the event. When her face appeared, Luther reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. But inside her, everything did. The truth was no longer theory. It was now public. Her name wasn't on the event flyer. Her credentials weren't in the system. But her face was on every screen. Undeniable. As the video ended, the auditorium remained frozen in stunned silence. Then, all at once, it began. Phones vibrated. Social media lit up. The image of her face paused mid-solution, eyes fixed on the board, raced across the internet like lightning through dry forest. Memes, headlines, think pieces, praise, outrage. Some hailed her as the black girl genius silenced by the system. Others accused the footage of being staged. Hashtags trended, each one more polarized than the last. The world didn't see nuance. They saw a symbol, and symbols once made public no longer belonged to themselves. Back at the hallway entrance, two administrators appeared with a sudden change of tone. Now they offered to escort Tiana inside. They smiled with plastic sincerity. They referenced protocol exceptions and real-time adjustments. Daniels refused. She led Tiana away before they could spin it further. Because now everyone had seen the truth, and none of them were ready for what came next. Tiana's face was now public, and the internet split in half. The internet moved fast, faster than Tiana could breathe. Within hours of the symposium video leaking, her name, her face, and her story had become digital currency. She was shared, posted, dissected. The clip of her solving the equation in silence became a viral watermark of brilliance and of rebellion. But the internet had no mercy. Some called her a genius. Others called her a fraud. Every comment was a reflection, not of her, but of the people watching. Articles titled "Janitor's Daughter Outsmarts Ivy League," clashed with op-eds, accusing her of trespassing. Cable news anchors debated the ethics of her presence in the lecture hall, while social media flooded with arguments about race, access, and who was allowed to be brilliant. And beneath it all, in the shadows of message boards and encrypted apps, came the threats. At first it was subtle. Fake accounts flooded her mentions, emails to unlisted inboxes. Stay in your lane. This isn't your space. You'll regret this. Then it escalated. Her high school was contacted by anonymous callers, claiming she had stolen proprietary university materials. Her father's job at Halcyon was targeted by petitions demanding his termination. Tiana never responded, but she read every word. She sat in silence on the living room floor, the same spot where she had first solved the equation. Her father's notebook unopened beside her. The pride that had once warmed her chest now felt like ice. Luther noticed the change. She no longer reached for the marker. She no longer wrote in the margins of newspapers, or flipped through textbooks at night. She sat still, like a photograph of someone who had once moved freely. He kept her home, not just from Halcyon, but from school, from stores, from sidewalks. It wasn't paranoia, it was history. He had seen what happened when black children were made into symbols. They weren't protected, they were watched. Daniels, alarmed by the escalation, offered to connect Tiana with legal advocates. She contacted the ACLU, then a black-owned law firm that specialized in civil rights cases. She knew this was no longer just about math. This was about ownership, of work, of narrative, of dignity. Elijah tried to shield her online. He reported every violent post. He contacted moderators. He wrote op-eds of his own, using his platform as a doctoral candidate to expose the undercurrent of racism, hidden behind academic concern. But the hate only adapted. It crawled deeper, smarter. The more she was defended, the more dangerous the backlash became. Inside Halcyon's administrative offices, Whitmore held private meetings with the board. Behind closed doors, he presented a new theory, that Tiana had gained access to restricted material through her father, that she had manipulated video evidence, that the footage was taken without consent. He called it academic misconduct. He called Daniels unprofessional. He framed Elijah as emotionally compromised. He didn't need to prove it. He just needed to create doubt. And in academia, doubt could erase a legacy before it began. But the video was undeniable. Every second of it, time-stamped, uninterrupted, authentic. Daniels had already submitted it to independent archives and educational institutions. It was peer-reviewed not by professors, but by mathematicians around the world who confirmed its accuracy. Still, Halcyon refused to acknowledge it publicly. They issued no statement, no apology, no invitation. They went silent. That silence spoke volumes. Tiana, meanwhile, lived in lockdown. News vans parked near her building, neighbors whispered. Some looked at her with awe, others with suspicion. Her father answered every knock with his chest tight and fists tucked. But what disturbed her most weren't the threats or headlines. It was the guilt. She hadn't asked to be seen. She hadn't done any of this for fame or disruption. She just wanted to understand, to solve, to know. But now, her mind, the one thing that had always made her feel safe, had become the reason she wasn't. She spent hours staring at her hands, as if unsure whether to be proud of them or afraid. Daniels visited frequently, each time trying to convince her that what she did mattered, not because of what it exposed, but because of what it proved. That brilliance didn't belong to gatekeepers. That legacy wasn't defined by whose name was on the building. But Daniels also knew the cost. Her own career had taken a hit. She had been excluded from faculty meetings. Department heads stopped replying to her emails. She'd been labeled difficult, emotional, erratic, all the coded words used to dismiss black women who refused to shrink. Still, she didn't regret it. She couldn't. Then one morning, as Tiana sat in the kitchen tracing the corner of a napkin with a dull pencil, the phone rang. It wasn't a threat this time. It was an offer. A major national news network wanted to feature her in a televised interview. Live. Prime time. Full control over the questions. A female black journalist would moderate. They called it a moment to reclaim the narrative. Luther hesitated. Daniels hesitated. Elijah warned her to think carefully. But Tiana said nothing. She simply closed her notebook, placed her pencil down, and stared out the window. She had spent her life trying not to be noticed. But now that the world had seen her, the real question was, would she speak? A major news outlet reached out to Tiana for a televised interview. The studio lights felt foreign, sterile, manufactured, and far too bright. They beamed down onto the center stage, reflecting off polished glass surfaces and bouncing off the metal framework above. The floor crew moved efficiently, their whispers sharp, their eyes always scanning. This wasn't a place built for a teenager, especially not one who had been told her whole life that brilliance belonged to others. Tiana sat alone under the spotlight. The studio had offered her options: stylists, wardrobe, makeup. She had declined. The blouse she wore belonged to Daniel's, pressed and carefully folded the night before. The pants were Elijah's sister's, cinched slightly at the waist. Her hair was pulled back into a simple braid, no adornment, no armor. Just herself. The host sat across from her, poised and practiced. A familiar face, one of the few black anchors in national prime time. She greeted Tiana, off camera, with a soft nod. But when the countdown began, her tone shifted into that of a professional pressing against history. The red light blinked on. Millions were watching. The segment began with a gentle introduction, the backstory everyone already knew but needed to hear again. A brilliant equation, a mystery solver, a storm of controversy. Then, slowly, the questions cut deeper. Was it really you? Do you have proof? Did you even understand what you solved? Each inquiry was delivered with care. But beneath them was the echo of a system that had never believed her kind capable of greatness. The doubt wasn't new, it was ancient, repackaged through polite syntax and intellectual skepticism. But Tiana didn't falter. She leaned forward, shoulders square, eyes steady. With no notes and no teleprompter, she explained the equation as if it were music. She spoke of its structure, its flaws, the logic of its missteps, the elegance of its correction. She used no jargon, no condescension, just clarity, just truth. The room stayed silent, save for the soft hum of recording equipment. Her words didn't just fill the air, they ruptured something inside it. And outside the studio, the world erupted. Within minutes, the segment was clipped and shared. Hashtags exploded across social platforms. Tiana solved it. Math is black too. Halcyon exposed. Public figures posted their support. Celebrities tweeted praise. Educators demanded systemic change. Politicians, sensing the swell of momentum, issued hollow endorsements disguised as moral outrage. For the first time in weeks, Tiana wasn't being questioned. She was being believed. But not everyone celebrated. Inside the walls of Halcyon University, panic returned. The board convened an emergency session that same night. The live stream had done more than validate Tiana's solution. It had exposed the institution's calculated silence, its elitist framework, its failure to protect a student, even one who technically wasn't enrolled. The footage from the symposium, the paper Daniels had submitted, and now the national broadcast, it was a triangulation of truth they could no longer ignore. So they pivoted to protection. Not of Tiana, of themselves. Behind closed doors, University Council began preparing a legal strategy. They framed Tiana's appearance on air as a violation of confidentiality. They claimed intellectual property rights over the lecture footage, citing it as recorded on university grounds. They labeled Professor Daniels' published paper as unauthorized release of academic content. The decision came quickly. A formal cease and desist letter was drafted and reviewed by a panel of legal advisors. It was addressed to both Tiana Green and Professor Imani Daniels. The language was dressed in legalese, but the intent was clear: stop speaking, or face consequences. Back at home, Tiana sat on the apartment couch, the television muted. She didn't need to hear the coverage. She already knew the words. Her segment replayed across multiple channels, her face now frozen in a dozen poses. Each frame captured a different version of her: brilliant, brave, controversial, dangerous, depending on who was narrating. Luther sat beside her, unmoving. He hadn't spoken since the segment ended. The pride in his eyes was complicated, pride tainted by fear. He had once believed education was the key. But now, he saw it wasn't about knowledge, it was about who was allowed to use it. Daniels entered carrying a stack of envelopes. One of them had arrived by courier. Thick, official, sealed in red trim. She opened it slowly, read it twice, then sat down, her posture heavier than before. The letter accused her of violating university protocols, of releasing proprietary academic content, of involving a minor in unsanctioned research. The threat was clear: halt all public discourse regarding the equation, or face legal action. Tiana received an identical copy. It didn't matter that she had never signed a single halcyon form. The institution had drawn its line. Daniels knew this move well. She had seen it used against whistleblowers, against adjuncts who refused to be silent, against students of color who protested. It was the tactic of institutions desperate to protect image over truth. But this time it was happening in the open, and the world was watching. Tiana took the letter and read it in full. No tears, no trembling. She read it the way she had once read equations, searching for pattern, intent, and flaw. She folded it neatly and placed it beside her, because she understood now her intellect wasn't what threatened them. Her visibility did. The university filed a cease and desist against Tiana and Professor Daniels. By sunrise, the photo had slipped from private faculty whispers into the electric veins of the internet. It started subtly. A single screenshot posted to an obscure mathematics subreddit titled "Unsolvable Equation." Solved? The caption was vague, but the image carried weight. A perfectly resolved problem. Circled annotations showing the corrected path. A signature style that didn't match the expected hands at Halcyon. Within hours, the post exploded with activity. Some users analyzed the solution line by line. Others debated its authenticity. Was it real? Was it planted? Was it AI generated? A few speculated it was a publicity stunt. But the math held. Every peer-reviewed glance confirmed its brilliance. The equation that Dr. Whitmore had arrogantly declared beyond student comprehension had been cracked, and by someone no one could name. It was Reddit at first, then X, then TikTok edits, then podcasts. By noon, a viral storm had overtaken academia and pop culture. Influencers posted exaggerated reactions. Educators tried to claim it as a teaching moment. Even a late-night comedy show aired a segment titled, "Genius Ghost Solves Ivy League Equation." Ghosted Halcyon faculty. The image had no author, no watermark, no traceable timestamp. The mystery gave it life, and gave those who thrived on elitism something to fear. Because what if the next Einstein wasn't wearing a lab coat or name tag? What if they were invisible? In the corner of a Halcyon faculty lounge, Dr. Whitmore scrolled through the trending chaos. He recognized his own handwriting behind the bold red annotations that had corrected his steps. He knew exactly which class this had come from, but he didn't speak. He didn't share the image. He only stared, jaw tight, fingers clenched. Somewhere beneath the noise, he sensed the unraveling. Tiana, meanwhile, was unaware of the digital firestorm igniting her brilliance. That morning, she returned to her quiet routine. At sunrise, she and her father rode the 5:42 a.m. bus, silent and side by side, the way they always did. Halcyon loomed in the distance, growing larger with every stop, a castle that never invited them through the front gate. Inside the building, Tiana mopped floors and emptied bins while students shuffled past, coffee in one hand, AirPods in the other. No one paid her any attention. She was invisible again. Or so she thought. When she entered Lecture Hall B to disinfect the desks, she noticed something odd. Several students were still huddled near the whiteboard, whispering. A few pointed at their phones. One had printed out the viral image and held it up for comparison. She froze, mop in hand. They didn't know it was her, but she knew it was her work, her proof, her clarity, her fingerprint on the board. A small ache pressed against her chest, not from fear, but from longing. To be seen, to be understood, not for what she wore or how she looked, but for the thoughts she carried, like a hidden fire. That longing had always lived inside her, but this time, it burned brighter. Her father, Luther, noticed her silence during their break. They sat on a bench just outside the science building, sharing a thermos of watered-down coffee. Tiana stared into the distance, the viral equation fresh in her mind. He had taught her everything he could, but he also knew how this world worked. How quickly the moment a black child demonstrated excellence, the system moved to either own it or erase it. There was no middle ground. It had happened to him. It had happened to others. He feared it would happen to her. So when he spoke, it wasn't just caution. It was survival instinct. He told her not to get involved. He told her the world wasn't built to make space for people like her in rooms like that. He told her that cleaning up after brilliance was safer than trying to be it. Tiana nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. She had tasted something in that lecture hall. Something she couldn't unfeel. The silence that used to feel safe. now felt suffocating. Back across campus, Elijah sat hunched over his laptop in the grad student lounge, watching the viral threads multiply. He hadn't expected this. He had simply tried to spark a conversation. Instead, he had triggered a revolution. Now he had a secret that the world wanted: the identity of the ghost who had solved the unsolvable. He wasn't sure what made him do it, but something pushed him to check the maintenance logs. It took time, but eventually, he found a name: Luther Green, the janitor on duty the night the image was captured. Further digging led him to Luther's emergency contact, Tiana Green. It clicked. Not a student, not faculty, a janitor's daughter. The realization left him stunned. Not because he doubted her brilliance, but because it exposed everything wrong with the system he was part of. Halcyon didn't know who she was because they never asked, never looked, never imagined that the next academic giant might be sweeping their floors. Later that day, Elijah waited near the custodial supply closet, rehearsing what he'd say. When Tiana emerged, backpack slung over one shoulder, he froze. She looked younger than he expected, and older too, like someone who had learned to hold the weight of being exceptional in a world built to ignore her. He approached cautiously. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't demand a retelling. He simply told her the truth, that he had seen her work, that her solution had gone viral, that people were already trying to claim it, and that she had a right to her credit. Tiana listened in silence. The walls she had built over years of being unseen remained intact, but something in his words stirred her. The idea of being known for her mind, not as a janitor's daughter, but as a mathematician, tempted her in ways she hadn't expected. But neither of them realized they were being watched. From a second-story window of the faculty building, Dr. Whitmore stood behind a half-closed curtain, gaze locked onto the sidewalk where Elijah and Tiana spoke. His suspicions were no longer suspicions. He knew. The solver wasn't a ghost. She was real. And she was dangerous, not because she had broken the rules, but because she had proven that the rules were built to exclude her in the first place. For Dr. Whitmore, it wasn't just about the equation. It was about control, about image, about the hierarchy that kept certain people below the line of recognition. Tiana's presence threatened to rewrite the narrative, not just of his lecture, but of his legacy, and that he could not allow. Dr. Whitmore was watching too, and he wasn't happy about the mystery solver being a janitor's black daughter. The envelope was thick, not from content, but from consequence. It arrived at Professor Imani Daniel's office the morning after Tiana's interview aired, marked with the insignia of Halcyon's legal department. The packet bore the cold precision of institutional retaliation. On the surface, it looked procedural, but Daniels knew better. This was not protocol. This was punishment. The language inside was cloaked in legal terminology. Cease and desist, unauthorized academic disclosure, violation of intellectual property. They accused Tiana of unlawfully accessing restricted campus materials. They accused Daniels of reckless supervision and public dissemination of internal academic content. They claimed ownership of the footage, of the problem, and most audaciously, of the solution itself. The unspoken message was louder: stay quiet, or we will bury you. Daniels stood in her office for several minutes, the letter dangling in her hand like a chain. She had anticipated backlash, but not like this. This wasn't about disagreement. It was erasure disguised as policy, and it wasn't just aimed at her. It was aimed at a child, a 16-year-old girl, whose only crime was knowing something she wasn't supposed to. Tiana received her own letter, delivered to their apartment door by courier. The sight of it froze her father in place. Luther read it silently, lips pressed tight. For a man who had been denied jobs, promotions, and credit for ideas whispered in rooms that never invited him back, the letter was too familiar. But this time it wasn't his name on the line. It was his daughter's. The next morning, Daniels called in every favor she had ever earned. She reached out to a civil rights law firm she had once partnered with for a university equity study that Halcyon quietly shelved. The firm, known for their aggressive litigation against institutional discrimination, agreed to take the case. Pro bono. They countersued. The claims: racial discrimination, academic gatekeeping, targeted defamation, and unlawful attempts to suppress free expression and academic discovery. The legal complaint was scathing. It laid bare Halcyon's history, from ignored bias reports to skewed hiring practices, from scholarship disparities to cultural erasures, and at its center the story of Tiana Green, the teenage prodigy whose brilliance had been denied a badge, a desk, a chair, And now, a voice. The filing made national headlines. Media outlets seized on the drama. Black teen genius sued by Ivy League giant. Janitor's daughter files countersuit against Halcyon University. Interviews multiplied. Experts weighed in. Lawyers debated. Protesters gathered outside Halcyon's wrought iron gates holding handmade signs. Genius nails enrollment. We built these halls too. But with publicity came pressure. Tiana's face was everywhere. Not as a girl, but as a symbol. Every photo, every soundbite, every comment thread dissected her existence. Her social media, though deactivated, was screenshot and passed around. Her silence was labeled, calculated. Her interviews too coached. Her skin color too convenient for a viral story. Daniels shielded her as best she could. Elijah provided academic breakdowns in support of the case, offering expert validation of Tiana's work. But the scrutiny pierced anyway. The world that once cheered for her to speak now demanded she defend every breath. The legal process moved slowly. Each court document dragged them deeper into discovery. A swamp of red tape, deposition notices, and institutional stonewalling. The university responded with smug confidence. They claimed the equation written on the board, even in its incorrect form, was part of Halcyon's intellectual property, that any public modification of it, even correction, was an act of academic overreach, that the classroom footage, recorded on university grounds, could not be lawfully distributed without institutional consent. Their argument was clear. Tiana may have solved it, but she didn't have the right to. Tiana attended the first court hearing flanked by Daniels and two attorneys. She didn't speak. She wasn't asked to. The courtroom, lined with polished wood and pale walls, felt colder than the studio. In the eyes of the law, she was not a student, not a professor, not a plaintiff, just a name at the center of noise. The judge ordered both parties into a 30-day mediation window. It was standard, but Daniels knew it was a stall. A delay meant to exhaust them, meant to make them disappear without a fight. At home, Tiana sat on the floor each night, legs crossed, staring into notebooks she no longer filled. Her brilliance hadn't dimmed, but it had been weaponized against her. She had walked into a lecture hall to solve a math problem. Now she was solving her own right to exist in the very world she had just proven she belonged to. But then, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, something changed. Daniels received a message on her university email, subject line blank. The body was a single sentence. I kept copies. Attached were 6 files, all scanned documents, all bearing Halcyon letterhead. They were internal memos. One outlined hiring freezes targeting applicants from historically black colleges. Another detailed scholarship review policies explicitly flagging non-traditional applicants. But the final file was the sharpest blade, a rejected internship application submitted by a young Luther Green 22 years ago. It had been stamped misplaced. Handwritten in the margins was a note. Too eager. Better to recommend for custodial if he needs work. Daniel stared at the screen, jaw tight. The voice behind the message remained anonymous. But the intent was undeniable. This was the missing piece. The proof that Halcyon hadn't just failed Tiana, they had systematically erased her family for a generation. She forwarded the documents to the legal team. Within an hour, they had filed an amended motion. And now the case was no longer just about a math problem. It was about history. A former Halcyon whistleblower contacted Daniels with confidential records. The files weren't just incriminating. They were a map. A blueprint of how brilliance had been buried beneath paperwork, protocol, and quiet prejudice for decades. Each scanned memo, each stamped denial, each scribbled margin note, pulled back the curtain on what many had long suspected. Halcyon University had never been a place of merit. It had been a fortress of preservation, of whiteness, of legacy, of gatekeeping, disguised as excellence. The man behind the email remained anonymous. Until he wasn't. 2 days after the documents arrived, Daniels received a voicemail. The voice was low, careful, and unmistakably familiar. It belonged to Harold Knox, a former senior administrator in Halcyon's admissions office. He had retired 5 years earlier, quietly, without ceremony. But before he left, he had made copies. Not for revenge, for proof, because even then, he knew the story would eventually break through. They met in secret at a neutral location, a closed-down community center once funded by Halcyon, as part of its diversity outreach initiative. The irony wasn't lost on Daniels. The center had been shuttered during budget cuts, but remained structurally intact, like a body left without breath. Harold arrived with a weathered briefcase, his posture heavy with regret. He didn't need to explain why he'd come. The look in Daniel's eyes was enough. She had seen enough systems from the inside to recognize when someone was finally done protecting them. Tiana sat beside her, quiet but alert. She had learned to read silences. Harold's was thick with shame. He laid the documents out one by one, memos stamped confidential, email printouts with redacted names, meeting summaries detailing strategic recruitment redirection, a term he now admitted was code for keeping black applicants off the radar. Scholarship application denials marked not for lack of merit, but for being non-traditional, too community-based, or simply not the right fit. And then came the final file, the one that stilled the room. Luther Green. Internship application. Dated 20 years ago. A perfect academic record from a public technical college. Letters of recommendation from 3 professors. A handwritten cover letter expressing a desire to become an engineering educator. Someone who could bridge theory and application for underrepresented youth. Stamped on the application in red ink. No recommendation. In black pen along the margin. Too persistent. Better redirected. Harold pointed to the initials next to the note. They belonged to a department head who had later recommended Luther for custodial employment after his application was misplaced. Tiana didn't flinch, but her hands, resting on her lap, curled slowly into fists. This wasn't an isolated failure. This was a legacy of erasure. Daniels took photos of everything. She scanned each page twice, cataloged every name, and contacted the civil rights firm within hours. This wasn't just evidence, it was a smoking archive. The next hearing was different. The courtroom was fuller now, with journalists in the back row, and protest signs posted near the courthouse gates. The media had followed every development. They wanted sound bites, headlines, victory or defeat. But what they got was history. Daniels presented the whistleblower evidence as part of an amended filing. The court clerk paused as she read through it. The judge, a black woman with years on the bench and eyes that had seen enough systemic loopholes to write her own book, took her time. The university's legal team tried to object, claiming the files were unverified, historically irrelevant, and outside the scope of the original claim. But the judge didn't blink. She looked over the papers. She looked at Tiana, 16, silent, and still somehow taller than the institution she was suing. Then she looked at the room full of people who had profited from silence. And she ruled. The case would proceed to public trial. It would no longer be a closed mediation. No longer behind doors guarded by lawyers and policy buffers. The discovery process would be made open. Testimonies would be heard under oath. The documents would be reviewed in court. For the first time, Halcyon would be on trial, not just for what they had done to Tiana, but for what they had built themselves to exclude. Outside the courthouse, the news broke fast. Cameras rolled, anchors scrambled to deliver the update in time for the evening broadcast. Civil rights groups issued statements. Students across campuses held solidarity rallies. Alumni began pulling donations. Faculty, previously silent, started leaking their own stories. Years of ignored complaints. Faculty panels stacked against equity hires. Diversity officers fired after raising concern. Tiana stayed quiet, but not out of fear. Her silence had changed. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was preparation. Because now the world wasn't just watching her. It was watching the walls she was tearing down. A judge ruled the case could proceed to public trial. The courthouse steps were flooded with signs, chants, and cameras. Some signs bore equations. Others bore portraits of Tiana, stenciled in bold lines, crowned with hashtags. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold morning air, their voices rising in waves against the stone facade. The glass doors opened to the building's core, but outside was where the pressure lived. Inside, the energy shifted. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a trial. Halcyon University versus Tiana Green. The girl without enrollment papers, without credentials, without an invitation. Yet here she was, sitting at the plaintiff's table, beside Professor Daniels and a team of civil rights attorneys. Poised as the walls that once excluded her, now echoed her name. Courtroom sketch artists captured her posture, the quiet dignity she carried. She wore the same cardigan she'd worn to her interview, her father's watch on her wrist. Daniels sat beside her, expression sharp and unreadable. Across the aisle, Halcyon's legal team flanked their counsel like a fortress. Sharp suits, glossy binders, eyes that never met hers. The trial began with Halcyon's defense. They opened with protocol, a long scroll of rules, enrollment standards, property rights, confidentiality clauses. They framed the lecture hall footage as intellectual property. They questioned the method of its distribution. They referred to Daniel's publication as reckless dissemination of unvetted academic material. Their argument was clinical, sanitized, measured. They didn't mention race. They didn't need to. Then Daniel stood. She didn't open with fire. She opened with facts. She walked the court through the documented timeline, the viral image, the anonymous solution, the internal investigation, the smear campaign. She reminded the court of the cease and desist order, the media manipulation, the institutional erasure. Then she paused, turned slightly, invited Tiana to the stand. The courtroom fell into silence. Tiana took her place at the witness table. The judge nodded, and then the girl they had once tried to label a trespasser began to speak, not in rage, not in fear, but in clarity. She explained the equation. Not just the solution, but the mistake at its core. She used analogies, diagrams, simplified logic. She spoke slowly, deliberately, building her case not with emotion but with understanding. Her explanation transcended mathematics. It was a masterclass in how brilliance doesn't require permission. Even the judge leaned forward. Pen paused mid-note. When she finished, the courtroom didn't erupt. It breathed, quietly, collectively. But the silence didn't last. Halcyon called Dr. Gerald Whitmore to the stand. He entered with a calm exterior, measured gait, polished lapels, but beneath it those who had known him long enough could see the crack. His arrogance had dulled into defensiveness. Under questioning, he denied ever seeing Tiana before the footage. He denied referring to her by name. He denied knowledge of any personal bias in the investigation. Then Daniels presented the email. Recovered during discovery, dated just days after the symposium. It was short, unambiguous, sent from Whitmore's official university account to a fellow faculty chair. This girl is a threat to everything we protect. A hush fell across the room. The judge lifted the page slowly, read the words again, and turned her gaze toward Whitmore. He didn't flinch, but his defense team did. That sentence changed everything. Because now the case was no longer about protocol. It was about protection, of status, of image, of legacy. And Tiana had become the unwelcome mirror reflecting all three. Still, the judge remained composed. She didn't issue a ruling. Not yet. Instead, she addressed the court with clarity. Given the complexity of the academic content and the conflicting testimonies, she would authorize an independent academic review. An expert panel, neutral, qualified, and unaffiliated, would examine the original equation, the published solution, and the lecture hall footage. Only then would the court proceed to judgment. It was a move neither side fully expected. Halcyon's team had hoped to drown the case in legality. Daniel's team had hoped the truth alone would be enough. But now the verdict would rest in the hands of external scholars, ones who had no loyalty to Halcyon or its reputation. And for the first time since the trial began, uncertainty entered the room. Because while Daniels trusted Tiana's solution implicitly, the institution that sought to erase her had just been handed the power to validate her. The judge paused proceedings for an independent academic review of Tiana's solution. The courtroom sat in limbo. Following the judge's order, the trial paused, not adjourned, but suspended in tense anticipation. For the first time in the case, the outcome no longer sat in the hands of lawyers, judges, or public opinion. It was now up to the only people both sides could agree were truly neutral: mathematicians. An independent review panel was assembled quietly, far from the noise of the media storm. 5 experts from different continents, all tenured, all published, all unaware of the origin of the solution they were asked to review. The court had stripped names from the submission, removing context, headlines, and history. All the panel received was the equation, the footage, and the published paper. Pure numbers, pure logic, pure proof. Tiana wasn't told the names of the reviewers. She wasn't allowed to speak to them. She wasn't allowed to defend her process or elaborate on her thinking. All she could do was wait. And waiting, for someone who had solved the problem in 20 minutes, felt endless. She spent her days inside, shielded by Daniels and the legal team. Each hour that passed twisted the silence tighter. The public rallied outside, but inside it was the quiet that rattled most. No cameras, No interviews. Just a girl, a notebook, and a verdict suspended in uncertainty. Elijah tried to offer comfort, bringing her old books, refilling her notebooks, suggesting new problems to solve. But Tiana didn't write. Not yet. Her mind, once restless with ideas, had narrowed into a single line: they're deciding if I'm real. Then, on the seventh day, the court received the report. It arrived sealed, signed and stamped by all 5 experts. Their decision was unanimous. Daniels, flanked by her team, entered the courtroom with cautious hope. Halcyon's attorneys sat across, expressionless, but their stiff posture betrayed a building anxiety. The judge entered. The gallery hushed. And then she read. The independent academic review panel concludes that the submitted solution is original, academically sound, and mathematically flawless. It demonstrates a unique method of problem solving consistent with high-level theoretical reasoning, and should be recognized as a legitimate intellectual contribution. Gasps broke out across the room. But the report didn't end there. It included a recommendation that the solver, though unaffiliated with any institution at the time of solving, be awarded honorary academic recognition for their contribution. A symbolic degree, a seat at the table, formally acknowledged. Tiana didn't react. Not visibly. But Daniels, sitting beside her, noticed the shift, the way her hands unclenched, the way her shoulders, once locked in quiet defense, lowered just slightly. Across the aisle, Halcyon's counsel scribbled notes furiously. Because while the courtroom filled with awe, applause, and flickers of redemption, the university was already preparing its next move. By the next morning, Halcyon's board of trustees released a statement. It congratulated the anonymous contributor for their brilliance. It commended the independent panel. It praised the power of academic discovery, without once naming Tiana. That afternoon, Daniels received a private message from Halcyon's legal team. It was an offer. A settlement. They would withdraw all claims. They would issue a retraction of their initial disciplinary statements. They would provide Tiana with a full scholarship to any university of her choosing, offer her father reinstatement with a promotion, and issue a public statement acknowledging the extraordinary mathematical achievement. But it came with one condition: a non-disclosure clause. No interviews, no book deals, no speaking engagements, no mention of Daniels, Elijah, or the legal battle, no recounting of the footage, the hearings, or the institutional pushback. Halcyon wanted to pay for her silence, because validation was acceptable, so long as it didn't come with a voice. Daniels read the letter twice, handed it to Tiana, and waited. Tiana read it once, then folded it neatly and set it aside. Outside, the world was still chanting her name, but inside, another equation had emerged, one not of numbers but of value. What was the cost of being right in a world that didn't want you to speak? Halcyon offered a private settlement, with a non-disclosure clause. The envelope wasn't heavy, but the weight of it pulled at every hand it passed through. It arrived by courier, this time not stamped with threats or legal jargon, but with gold foil and a blue ribbon. Inside, a letter, a contract, and a check. 6 figures, crisp, printed, unmistakably real. Halcyon's final offer. The letter's tone had shifted. Gone was the cold language of accusations and ownership. In its place, admiration, applause, carefully crafted phrases of acknowledgement and gratitude. They called Tiana a remarkable young mind. They called her solution a valuable contribution to mathematical thought. They called the controversy a regrettable misunderstanding born of bureaucratic oversight. The check came with a full scholarship to Halcyon or any Ivy League of her choice. The contract included a public statement of academic recognition and an official media retraction of prior allegations. They even offered Luther back pay, a retirement package, and an honorary staff award. But the final page told the truth. Tiana was to agree to permanent non-disclosure. She would not speak publicly about her experience. No interviews, no memoirs, no books, no documentaries, no TED Talks, no mention of Daniels, no references to the footage. The legal battle would vanish from the record. The world would know her as the girl who was smart, but never how far she had to go just to be heard. It was silence, paid in full. Tiana sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before her. The contract curled at the edges beneath the heat of the lamp. Across from her, Luther remained still, hands clasped together, staring at the check like it might breathe if he blinked. He wanted peace. He had lived with the burden of pushing too far, of speaking too loudly. He had watched doors close on his future, until all that remained was a mop and a night shift. He had seen what silence could buy, and what noise could cost. To him, the check was more than money. It was safety. Elijah, sitting beside the fridge with his back to the wall, didn't speak at first. He respected Luther's silence, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his anger. To him, the offer wasn't compromise. It was theft, institutional theft of narrative, of legacy, of struggle. He wanted justice. He wanted the world to see not just the solution, but the systems Tiana had outwitted. Daniels arrived last. She didn't ask what was in the envelope. She had seen too many like it. Not with six-figure checks, but with veiled threats and bureaucratic apologies. She knew the language of silencing, of strategic generosity. She knew this wasn't a reward, it was erasure with a comma and a signature line. She wanted memory. She wanted history to remember not just that Tiana solved the problem, but that she was never supposed to. Tiana listened to them all. Their voices didn't clash. They collided like truths facing different walls, and she didn't speak for hours. She sat there, a girl not yet 17, asked to choose between a future paved in silence and a road marked by resistance. She reread the clause about Daniels. The line that said she could no longer name the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. The clause that treated mentorship like liability, that treated friendship like risk. Then she stood. She took the check in both hands. It didn't tremble. Neither did she. 2 days later, the network that had hosted her original interview invited her back, not for debate, but for closure. They framed it as a final word, a resolution. She arrived wearing the same outfit, the same braid, no makeup, no stylist, just present. The host introduced the segment, summarized the offer, posed the question of legacy, and then, live beneath millions of eyes across the country, Tiana answered. She held up the check, its printed numbers gleaming beneath the studio lights. Then she tore it in half. Once, then again, and let the pieces fall to the table. The camera zoomed in, catching every frame. There was no applause, no music, no swelling soundtrack. Just breath. She didn't need to say a word, because silence, when chosen freely, can become power. Tiana tore the check in half on live television. The footage of the torn check spread like wildfire. It was clipped, captioned, subtitled, translated. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 60 million times across platforms. News outlets replayed it hourly. Influencers called it the most powerful silence in modern protest. Historians called it a defining moment of academic rebellion. But for Tiana Green, it wasn't a protest. It was punctuation. The full stop at the end of a sentence she never asked to write. 3 weeks later, she stood beneath the domed ceiling of the National Education Reform Summit in Washington, D.C. The crowd stretched beyond the seats, filling the aisles and the standing room sections along the back walls. Educators, policymakers, students, and press, all there not for an agenda, but for a voice. Tiana didn't enter with a team. No handlers, no press manager, just Daniels at her side and a notebook clutched in her hand. The stage was modest. A single podium, a plain background, but behind her the screen glowed with her name, not in headlines, not in controversy, but in recognition. She stepped up to the mic. No teleprompter, no introduction. She looked out at a room full of people who once debated her existence without ever learning her name. Then she began. She didn't talk about equations. She talked about being 11 years old, watching her father clean classrooms he was never allowed to teach in. She talked about learning calculus in a janitor's closet, with textbooks someone else had thrown away. She talked about sitting in the back of a lecture hall, unseen, unheard, watching a room built to celebrate brilliance, mock the kind of mind she had quietly become. She talked about what it meant to know something, truly know it, and be told you didn't belong near the whiteboard where that knowledge was displayed. She spoke slowly, deliberately. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply laid out the math of it all. The ratio of legacy admits to first-gen students, the probability of black faculty advancement in majority-white institutions, the algorithm of systemic exclusion, disguised as meritocracy. She spoke of Daniels, not by title, but by impact. Of Elijah, not by profession, but by choice. Of her father, not as a janitor, but as an engineer the system had quietly buried. And she spoke of herself, not as a victim, not as a genius, but as proof that brilliance exists everywhere, even where institutions have refused to look. When she finished, the room didn't erupt. It inhaled, deep, long, collective. Then, finally, exhaled. The ovation lasted 4 minutes. It wasn't just applause, it was release. The footage of that speech, too, went viral. But this time it wasn't just Tiana trending. It was change. Within a week, universities across the country began reviewing their admissions policies. Legacy preference programs came under fire. Donors, previously silent, began withdrawing funds from Halcyon. Petitions swelled. Student bodies organized walkouts. Halcyon's own student union declared a week of protest, occupying the administration building and staging teaching sessions on institutional racism. Daniels received invitations to speak on faculty power structures. Elijah began mentoring high school students full-time. And Luther? He went back to work, but not at Halcyon. He took a new role as director of facilities for an HBCU in Georgia, where every plaque on the wall told a different story, one of survival, of struggle, and of brilliance not only acknowledged but celebrated. Tiana, meanwhile, declined every university offer. She had no interest in being anyone's diversity headline. Instead, she began building a fellowship program for gifted students from low-income families. She partnered with math departments around the country to offer virtual classes and real mentorship, free of charge. She didn't want fame. She wanted access for others. And then, one morning, in a news update tucked beneath the fold of a national paper, the headline read, "President of Halcyon University announces immediate resignation." No statement. No explanation. Just the quiet collapse of a tower that had once stood untouchable. The president of Halcyon announced his resignation. A year is not long in the life of a university. Endowments stretch decades. Buildings take generations to rename. Professorships are passed, like heirlooms. But in just 12 months, everything around Tiana Green had transformed, not because time allowed it, but because truth had demanded it. She didn't disappear after the trial. She didn't vanish into academic abstraction or retreat into the quiet corners brilliance is so often exiled to. Instead, she stepped forward, not into Halcyon's halls. She never went back there, but into something she built herself. It began with an idea on the back of a napkin during a late-night meal shared with Daniels and Elijah. 3 names, 1 vision. A center that would do what so many institutions had refused to: recognize genius before pedigree, provide access without conditions, and teach not just math but belief. The name came easily. The Luther Institute. Not because her father asked for it, but because he never had. They launched with no marble statues, no iron gates, no generational wealth. They launched with repurposed classrooms in a donated community center and laptops bought with crowd-funded donations. But what they lacked in prestige, they made up for in clarity. The Luther Institute was free. Always. Math, science, technology. All open to underrepresented students, aged 10 to 18. No tests, no essays, no tuition. Just curiosity. Tiana taught the first class herself. She didn't dress like a professor. She didn't use words to intimidate. She moved through equations like music, showing her students that solving was not a gift. It was a language, one they could all learn. Daniels became dean of curriculum. She redesigned traditional math instruction, decolonizing concepts and weaving in Black mathematicians long erased from textbooks. She made every lesson a window into what academia had tried to wall off. Elijah joined the board and led mentorship development. He matched students with scientists, engineers, architects, people who looked like them, spoke like them, and believed in them. And Luther? He retired quietly, but not invisibly. His story was now a cornerstone of the Institute's philosophy. Brilliance isn't a rare trait. Access is. Every time a new student crossed the threshold, they walked into a space born from the legacy of a man once handed a mop instead of a blueprint. Media outlets returned. Awards rolled in. Honors from academic societies, civil rights groups, even congressional commendations. Tiana received letters from other students, young, brilliant, unseen, thanking her not for being right, but for being loud. She read each one. Not as a celebrity, as a mirror. Halcyon, meanwhile, restructured. New leadership, new diversity initiatives, but no apology. Their silence stood as a monument to how institutions shift without ever truly bending. Tiana didn't care. She didn't need their halls. She had built her own. and the world noticed. Books were written. Her curriculum was modeled in pilot programs across the country. Her equation was studied not for its complexity, but for what it represented: the audacity of brilliance in a body the world refused to expect it from. But perhaps the most unexpected recognition came through a phone call from a major studio. They had optioned the rights to her story, not as a documentary, not as a classroom special, but as a full cinematic feature, wide release, global distribution. The script would send her not on the court case or the equation, but on the girl who refused to be erased. And the role of Tiana? They'd offered it to an actress she had grown up watching, a woman whose poster had once hung above her bed, whose performances made her believe quiet girls could be powerful. This time the world wouldn't just listen. They would watch. The film adaptation rights were just sold, and Tiana would be played by an actress she once idolized. They tried to erase her name, her mind, her place in the world, but she chose to rise louder than their silence. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever watched someone brilliant be buried by bias, then you know this wasn't just her fight, it's ours. Type yes if you believe brilliance has no color. Subscribe if this broke your heart, and lit a fire.